On January 20th, 1942, in a villa on the shores of the Wannsee Lake in Berlin, 15 high-ranking Nazi officials gathered for a meeting that would last barely 90 minutes. A meeting so brief and so bureaucratically mundane in its proceedings that several participants later claimed they could barely remember what had been discussed. That it seemed like just another administrative conference among the countless such meetings that filled their calendars during wartime. They drank cognac, they ate lunch, they discussed logistics and jurisdictional boundaries and procedural details with the calm professionalism of civil servants coordinating a complex interagency project. And when the meeting concluded, they returned to their offices to continue with the rest of their day's work, apparently undisturbed by what they had just participated in planning. The man who had convened this meeting, who had prepared the agenda and guided the discussion with the smooth efficiency of an experienced administrator chairing a corporate board meeting, was SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich. And what these 15 men had just agreed to, what they had discussed over cognac and lunch with such bureaucratic detachment, was the systematic murder of every Jewish person in Europe. Approximately 11 million human beings whose deaths would be organized with the same administrative precision that might be applied to coordinating railway schedules or managing industrial production quotas. Reinhard Heydrich was 37 years old at the time of the Wannsee Conference, already recognized throughout the Nazi hierarchy and feared throughout occupied Europe as one of the most dangerous men in the Third Reich, the primary architect of the Nazi terror apparatus, the man whose cold intelligence and ruthless efficiency had built the systems of surveillance, repression, and mass murder that would define Nazi occupation policy. Hitler himself called him the man with the iron heart, and even among Nazi leaders known for their brutality and fanaticism, Heydrich stood out for the combination of intellectual brilliance and complete emotional detachment that allowed him to design systems of oppression and murder with the creative problem-solving energy that another person might bring to designing elegant engineering solutions or composing complex musical arrangements. Welcome to Forgotten Minds. Today, we dissect the psychology of Reinhard Heydrich, exploring how a mind capable of genuine intellectual sophistication, a person who could play violin beautifully and appreciate classical culture, who possessed organizational genius and strategic vision that might have made him successful in any number of legitimate fields, instead devoted those considerable talents to perfecting the machinery of genocide. Reinhard Tristan Eugen Heydrich was born on March 7, 1904, in Halle, Germany, into a cultured musical family where intellectual and artistic achievement were valued and expected, where young Reinhard was exposed from earliest childhood to classical music, literature, and the refined cultural traditions of the German bourgeoisie. His father Bruno was a composer and opera singer who had founded a successful music conservatory, providing the family with comfortable middle-class status and immersing his children in an environment where artistic excellence and cultural sophistication were the daily atmosphere. Reinhard showed early talent, particularly for violin, which he played with considerable skill throughout his life. And he was intelligent, excelling in his studies, demonstrating the kind of quick analytical mind that grasped complex concepts easily and could see connections and patterns that others missed. Everything about this background should have produced someone who contributed to culture and civilization rather than to their destruction, someone whose intelligence and talents enriched the world rather than brutalized it. And yet there was something else present in young Reinhard's formation, a psychological wound that would shape everything that followed, that would transform his considerable gifts into instruments of cruelty and domination. The wound was rumor, persistent whispers that followed the family throughout Reinhard's childhood and adolescence, rumors that his paternal grandmother had been Jewish, that the family name had been changed from Süß to Heydrich, to hide Jewish ancestry, that despite all their cultural refinement and social pretensions, the Heydrichs were tainted by racial contamination according to the increasingly prevalent anti-Semitic ideology of early 20th century Germany. Whether these rumours had any factual basis remains historically uncertain and ultimately irrelevant to understanding their psychological impact, because what mattered was that young Reinhard grew up acutely aware that his legitimacy was questioned, that his right to belong to the German cultural elite he identified with was constantly under suspicion, that his identity was precarious and required constant defense and proof. His classmates taunted him with the nickname Moses Handel, in reference to both the Jewish rumours and his musical talents. And this adolescent mockery appears to have created in him a wound that never healed, a core of insecurity and rage that no amount of achievement or power would ever fully satisfy or resolve. When your fundamental right to belong to your chosen identity group is questioned, when you are marked as potentially contaminated or fraudulent, when your legitimacy is perpetually under suspicion, one possible response is hyper-identification with the threatened identity, an exaggerated performance of belonging that goes beyond what would be required of someone whose membership was never questioned. Reinhard Heydrich would spend his entire adult life proving that he was more German than anyone who had never faced such questions, more racially pure in his ideology, if potentially questionable in his ancestry, more fanatically committed to anti-Semitic policies, precisely because he needed to demonstrate, beyond any possible doubt, that he was something other than what the childhood rumours had suggested he might be. Heydrich's path into the Nazi hierarchy began with failure and humiliation, which only intensified the psychological dynamics that would shape his later behaviour. He had joined the German Navy as a young officer, had seemed destined for a successful military career, when he was abruptly dismissed in 1931 for misconduct, involving a broken engagement to a woman whose father had connections to senior naval leadership. The dismissal was experienced by Heydrich as a profound humiliation, another rejection that confirmed his sense that his position was always precarious, that he could never simply rely on his talents and achievements. Heinrich Himmler recruited Heydrich into the SS shortly after his naval dismissal, recognizing in this bitter, brilliant, recently humiliated young man exactly the qualities he needed for building the intelligence and security apparatus that would become the SD. Himmler understood intuitively that people who feel they have something to prove, who are driven by insecurity and resentment, who possess intelligence combined with a desperate need for validation and revenge, often make the most dedicated and ruthless servants of authoritarian systems, because they channel their considerable energies into serving the system that provides them with the status and power that society had previously denied them. Heydrich threw himself into building the SD with creative energy and systematic thoroughness, demonstrating almost immediately the particular combination of intellectual gifts and moral emptiness that made him so valuable to the Nazi project and so dangerous to its victims. He had an extraordinary talent for organization and system building, for seeing how complex operations could be structured efficiently, for identifying vulnerabilities in existing systems and designing procedures to exploit them. He understood information and how to gather it, process it, weaponize it, recognizing that comprehensive surveillance and detailed files on potential enemies and even on allies provided power that could be used to manipulate, to blackmail, to control. Within a few years, Heydrich had transformed the SD from a small party intelligence office into a sophisticated apparatus of surveillance and repression. And his success led to progressively greater responsibilities and power. When Himmler consolidated control over all German police forces under SS command, Heydrich became the operational chief, the man who actually ran the Gestapo, the criminal police, the security police, the man who designed and implemented the systems that would identify, track, arrest, interrogate, and eliminate anyone deemed an enemy of the Nazi state. He approached this work with what observers described as cold brilliance, with an analytical detachment that allowed him to design systems of oppression and murder as intellectual puzzles to be solved through clever application of organizational principles and human psychology. By the time Reinhard Heydrich convened the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, he had already been intimately involved in developing and implementing mass murder for more than 2 years. Having overseen the Einsatzgruppen operations that followed the German invasion of the Soviet Union, mobile killing units that had murdered over 1 million Jews and others through mass shootings in occupied territories. The experience with the Einsatzgruppen had revealed both the feasibility of mass murder and its limitations when conducted through direct shooting, particularly the psychological toll on the killers and the logistical challenges of disposing of enormous numbers of bodies. What Heydrich presented at Wannsee was the solution to these problems, a comprehensive plan that would industrialize and bureaucratize murder to overcome the inefficiencies and difficulties of the Einsatzgruppen approach. The Jews of Europe would be systematically identified through existing government records, concentrated in transit camps and ghettos, transported by rail to dedicated extermination facilities in occupied Poland, and killed in gas chambers designed specifically for efficient mass murder, with their bodies disposed of in crematoria that would eliminate the evidence and the sanitation problems associated with mass graves. The entire process would be coordinated across multiple government agencies, with clear jurisdictional boundaries and procedural guidelines, with careful attention to maintaining secrecy and managing the various logistical challenges. The minutes of the Wannsee Conference reveal Heydrich's approach to organizing genocide with chilling clarity. The language is bureaucratic and euphemistic, discussing evacuation and resettlement rather than murder, framing the extermination of 11 million people as an administrative challenge requiring coordination between various governmental departments. Heydrich's role was to secure agreement and cooperation from the representatives of those departments, to address their concerns about jurisdiction and procedure, to ensure that the machinery of the German state would operate smoothly in implementing the final solution. What the conference reveals about Heydrich's psychology is the completeness of his moral detachment, his ability to treat genocide as an intellectual and organizational problem requiring creative solutions and efficient execution. There is no evidence of any moral qualms or emotional disturbance. No suggestion that Heydrich or most of the other officials present experienced what they were planning as horrifying or even particularly remarkable. They were solving a problem, coordinating a complex operation, and they approached it with the same professional focus that might be brought to organising any large-scale governmental project. On May 27, 1942, just 4 months after chairing the Wannsee Conference, Reinhard Heydrich was ambushed by Czech resistance fighters as his car drove through Prague. A bomb was thrown at his vehicle, and shrapnel from the explosion lodged in his body, leading to an infection that killed him 8 days later. He was 38 years old, at the height of his power and influence, recognized throughout the Nazi hierarchy as indispensable to the functioning of the terror and extermination apparatus he had built. Reinhard Heydrich forces us to confront one of the most disturbing truths about human psychology and the nature of evil in the modern world, which is that intelligence and cultural sophistication provide no protection against moral bankruptcy, that a person can possess genuine intellectual gifts and aesthetic sensibility while simultaneously devoting those gifts to designing systems of oppression and murder. The Enlightenment assumption that education and culture necessarily produce moral improvement, that exposing people to great art and literature and complex ideas will make them more humane and less likely to commit atrocities, collapses completely when confronted with someone like Heydrich, who could appreciate Bash in the evening and design genocide in the morning, without experiencing any apparent conflict between these activities. His psychology reveals mechanisms that allowed this coexistence of brilliance and brutality to function without internal contradiction. The hyper-identification with Nazi ideology driven by childhood insecurity about his own legitimacy provided moral justification, transforming murder from crime into necessary defense of racial purity. The bureaucratic framing of genocide as an administrative and logistical challenge, rather than as a moral question, allowed him to engage his considerable problem-solving abilities without confronting the human consequences of the systems he was designing. The compartmentalization that kept different aspects of his personality separated from each other prevented his aesthetic sensibility from contaminating his work-organizing mass murder. The warning that Heydrich's life provides is that intelligence can be weaponized, that organizational genius and strategic vision can be employed to amplify evil rather than to resist it, that the same cognitive abilities that could solve complex problems for human benefit can solve equally complex problems for causing maximum human suffering with minimum expenditure of resources and effort. The systems he designed, the procedures he established, the organizational structures he built for implementing the Holocaust represent the application of genuine intellectual creativity and administrative talent to the project of making genocide efficient and comprehensive. We like to believe that smart people will recognize evil and refuse to participate in it, that intelligence correlates with moral insight and ethical behavior, that education creates psychological barriers against cruelty and atrocity. Reinhard Heydrich demonstrates definitively that these comforting assumptions collapse under examination, that intelligence and culture are morally neutral tools that can be employed in the service of any goal or ideology, that what protects against atrocity is something other than intelligence or education, something related to empathy and moral imagination, and the capacity to recognize the humanity of others, regardless of how they are categorized by the ideological systems we have internalized. This has been Forgotten Minds. Remember that intelligence without empathy is dangerous, that brilliance without moral grounding can be monstrous, that the most sophisticated evil is often perpetrated by the most capable minds when they are driven by insecurity and justified by ideology. Until next time, stay vigilant,